Selectors are one of the most important and powerful parts of CSS. They are essentially patterns that allow us to target HTML elements and apply styles to them. When we define a selector in our style sheet, we're instructing the browser to match every instance of that selector in the HTML. Now, we already saw selectors at work in the previous stage when we created simple selectors to change the colors of headings, paragraphs, and backgrounds. In this deep dive, we'll learn the different ways we can define a selector, as selectors can be defined based on an element's type, its class or ID name, or even its position in the document. So first, let's get started with basic type selectors, then we'll get more specific as we go. So here we have a simple HTML document containing an H1, H2, and a few paragraph elements. And we can see what it's looking like in the browser so far. Besides the default browser styles, no author styles have been applied just yet. So let's add a few styles of our own by first creating a new CSS file. So in our text editor, I'll go ahead and open up a new file, and I will save it style.css and save it in the CSS folder. Next, we'll need to link our new CSS file to our HTML document. So over in our index.html file, under the title tag, I will add link rel equals style sheet, followed by href, and inside I will add the path to the new style sheet. So we know it's in the CSS directory, and the file name is style.css. So I'll go ahead and save our HTML file and go back into style.css, where we'll be creating a few simple styles using CSS properties and values that you might not be familiar with just yet. But don't worry, because we'll be covering those properties and values in greater detail in the values and unit stage. For now, we'll only need to understand how CSS selectors work. So the very first selector we'll cover is called the universal selector. It's called a universal selector because it selects every element on the page at once and applies the styles we set. The universal selector is a very powerful selector because it takes precedence over all other selectors, as we'll soon find out. So to create a universal selector, we simply use an asterisk as our selector, followed by a set of curly braces. Inside these curly braces is where we write the properties and values we'd like to apply universally to our page. So for example, I will start with a margin property and a value of 0, and I will follow that with a padding property where I'll also give it the value 0, and a color property with the value red. Now, in the previous stage, we learned that browsers have a built-in style sheet called the user agent style sheet that by default applies padding and margins to the body, headings, list, paragraphs, and other elements on the page. By setting the margin and padding to 0, we're telling the browser to remove all margins and padding from every element on the page, then change their font color from the default black to red. So let's go ahead and save this file and take a look at it in the browser. When I refresh the browser, we can see how all the padding and margins have been removed from all heading and paragraph elements on the page, and the font color is now red. Now, because this is a very powerful selector, we'll need to be careful how we use it. For example, inheritance in CSS values will not work when we use the universal selector. So we lose that inheritance from parent elements we discussed in the previous stage, because the universal selector trumps any form of inherited styles. Now, because of that, we'll need to write a lot of extra CSS for child elements. So for now, we'll go ahead and remove this universal selector rule from our style sheet. But in a later video, we'll go over the ways this selector can be useful. So next up, we'll talk about type selectors. A type selector is what we use to select an element type on the page. They're also called element selectors because we only use the element's HTML tags as the selector. So we can use any of the HTML or HTML5 tags as selectors in our CSS. So for example, if we want to add a background color and padding to our page, in our CSS file, we can simply select the body element by typing body, followed by a set of curly braces. Again, inside the curly braces, we can then declare the background color property, and we'll go ahead and give it a color value of light blue. Below that, I will add a padding property with a value of 40 pixels. So when I save this and refresh it in the browser, notice how the background color of our page has changed to light blue, and there is this padding separating the content from the edges of the page. Because the body selector we just wrote instructed the browser to change the background color from white to light blue and add 40 pixels of padding. So again, if we need to select and add styles to the heading 1 on the page, in our style sheet, we'll simply type H1 to select the heading 1 element, and inside the curly braces, we can add the properties and values we want to declare. So this time I will give it a color property, and the color value will be a darker shade of blue. I will also change the font size to 40 pixels. So when I save this and refresh the browser, we can see how our heading 1 has turned blue and the font size has increased to 40 pixels. Next, we'll use another type selector to target the H2 in our page. So back in our style.css file, we'll type H2 to select the H2 element. And inside the curly braces, we will add a color property. And this time, we'll make the color value a light shade of red. So when we save this and review it in the browser, there we see our heading 2 turn red. Now, let's say we want to select and style every paragraph on the page. Well, we can easily accomplish that with a type selector. So in our style.css file, we'll simply type P to select every paragraph. And we will give it a color property with the value white, followed by 10 pixels of padding. And we will add a background color, and the value will be blue. Again, don't worry if you don't understand some of these properties just yet, because we'll be covering them in the next few stages. So when we save our CSS and refresh the browser, we can see how the paragraph type selector we just created matches every paragraph on the page. And they're now styled with the color, padding, and background properties we defined. We can also combine type selectors to create what are called descendant selectors. A descendant selector selects an element that is a descendant of another element. So, for example, in our HTML file, we can see this span element nested inside the H1. So we can say that the span element is a descendant of the H1. Now, because of this, we can create a descendant selector that only targets this span element inside the H1. To create a descendant selector, we'll need to use 2 or more selectors separated by white space. So in our CSS file, we'll first type H1 to select the heading 1, followed by a space, then the span type selector. Inside the curly braces, I'll add a color property, and I'll give it a dark blue color value. So when we save the CSS file and refresh the browser, we can see that it only affected that span element inside the heading 1. In our HTML file, notice that there are other span elements nested inside the paragraphs and in the heading 2 element that were not selected. Now, if we want to style the span element inside of our paragraphs, all we need to do is create a new descendant selector for that. So in our CSS, we will type P to select all paragraphs, followed by a space, then span. Next, I will add a color property with the color black, and I will give it a font weight of bold. So I'll save this CSS file, and when we refresh the browser, we can see that the only span elements that turn black and bold are the ones nested inside our paragraphs. Now, if we only want to style the span element inside our H2 instead of the one up here in the H1, we can simply change our selector. So in our CSS, I will simply change H1 to H2. And when we save it and refresh the browser, there we go. Now the span in the H2 is the one that turns navy blue.